Today, we're going to cover 3 murder cases so brutal, they broke the detectives who worked them. These were people who had seen it all, who thought nothing could shake them, but they were dead wrong. Welcome to Primetime Crime Content Warning. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Now, let's begin. The Michelle Martinko cold case, December 19, 1979. 6 days before Christmas. The parking lot of Westdale Mall in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, is bustling with last-minute shoppers. Inside, an 18-year-old girl with blonde hair styled like Farrah Fawcett is shopping for a winter coat. Her name is Michelle Martinko, and she has about 4 hours left to live. By 4 a.m. the next morning, mall security would find her body slumped in her family's Buick. She'd been stabbed 29 times. Her killer would walk free for 39 years, and when he was finally caught, it wouldn't be because of traditional detective work. It would be because of a drinking straw and a website where people search for their ancestors. This is the story of how a cold case that haunted an entire community for 4 decades was finally solved by technology that didn't even exist when the crime was committed. This is the story of Michelle Martinko. Michelle Marie Martinko was born on October 6, 1961, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She was the younger of 2 daughters, and according to her sister Janelle, she was a miracle. Their mother Janet had suffered 5 miscarriages before Michelle came along. Michelle wasn't just loved by her family. She was the kind of teenager that everyone seemed to like. She was a good student at Kennedy High School, not the very top of her class, but solidly above average. She sang in the school choir. She was on the twirling squad. She performed in theater productions. She had plans to attend Iowa State University to study interior design. Her friends remember her as kind, sweet, and funny. She loved to dress up. She was beautiful, with that iconic 70s blonde hair that she took care to style perfectly. Some people thought other girls were jealous of her because of her looks and her stylish clothes. She didn't have a ton of close girlfriends, but the ones she had were loyal. She dated too. There was a boy named Mike Wyrick who'd been her boyfriend. There was another boy named Andy Sadel who was head over heels for her. High school drama, high school romance, all the normal stuff. On the evening of December 19th, 1979, Michelle attended a banquet for the Kennedy Concert Choir at the Sheraton Inn. It was a normal school event. After it ended, she headed to Westdale Mall. Her mother had put a winter coat on layaway, and Michelle had been given the money to pick it up. It should have been a simple errand. Get the coat, drive home, probably wrap some Christmas presents. She had no idea that someone was watching her. We don't know exactly when Michelle left the mall that night. We don't know if she noticed anyone following her. What we do know is that at some point she made it back to her family's Buick in the parking lot. She got into the driver's seat. She turned on the engine, probably to warm up the car. It was December in Iowa. It was cold, and then someone opened the door. They pushed her over toward the passenger seat, and they stabbed her. 29 times. The attack was frenzied, brutal, and personal. She had defensive wounds on her hands. She fought. God, she fought. But she was overpowered. One of the stab wounds penetrated her sternum and pierced her aorta. She bled to death right there in that car. She was 18 years old, 6 days before Christmas. The killer had worn rubber gloves, so there were no fingerprints. But Michelle had fought hard enough that she'd managed to injure her attacker. The killer's hand had been cut during the struggle, probably from the knife slipping. Blood that wasn't Michelle's was found on the gear shift. Blood was also found on her black dress. The killer had left something behind. His DNA. In 1979, that meant absolutely nothing. DNA profiling wouldn't become a thing for another decade. But 40 years later, that blood would be the key to solving the case. Michelle's parents called police around 2 a.m. when she hadn't come home. By 4 a.m., mall security found her body. Every single police officer in Cedar Rapids was called in. For a city of 110,000 people, this kind of violence was unheard of. Detective Harvey Denlinger, who would work the case for years, said he'd never seen anyone stabbed that many times. This wasn't a robbery. Michelle still had her money. This also wasn't a sexual assault. This was something else. Something more disturbing. Random violence or targeted rage. The city was terrified. Cedar Rapids police threw everything they had at this case. Within a week, over 200 people had responded to their appeals for information. They interviewed hundreds of people. They used polygraphs to clear suspects. They even brought in psychics, which tells you how desperate they were getting. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on Andy Seidel, Michelle's ex-boyfriend who had been so in love with her. At Michelle's funeral, his behavior drew attention. He was, according to witnesses, almost in the casket with her. He was sobbing, dramatic, asking her friends whether Michelle had loved him or loved Mike, her other ex-boyfriend. His grief seemed performative to some people. Suspicious. He was questioned extensively by police, but they couldn't tie him to the crime. Eventually, he left Cedar Rapids and joined the Navy. Michelle's parents, Janet and Albert, were convinced Andy had killed their daughter. They would die in the 1990s still believing that. But they were wrong. There was another prime suspect who emerged. Dennis Lee McKee, a man who had broken into a woman's home in Cedar Rapids just a month before Michelle's murder. He'd held a knife to her throat, threatened to kill her children, and raped her. The similarities were striking. A knife. Cedar Rapids. Violence against women. McKee would eventually be convicted of that rape and sent to prison for life. When he died in 2012 from cancer while still incarcerated, some people wondered if he'd taken the secret of Michelle's murder to his grave. But he hadn't killed Michelle either. In June 1980, police released a composite sketch based on descriptions from 2 witnesses who'd been hypnotized. It showed a white man in his late teens or early 20s, about 6 feet tall, around 165 to 175 pounds, with brown eyes and curly brown hair. The sketch looked nothing like the actual killer, but nobody knew that yet. As the months turned into years, as leads dried up and the case grew cold, the reward money climbed to $10,000. Half of it was donated by Michelle's family, who just wanted answers. By 1986, the case was sitting on ice, as one investigator later put it. The trail had gone completely cold. For 27 years, Michelle's case sat in filing cabinets gathering dust. Her parents died without knowing who had killed their daughter. Her friends grew up, got married, and had kids of their own. But they never forgot. Tracy Price, who had sung in the choir with Michelle, said the murder had scared the hell out of them. Mike Wyrick, who dated Michelle, said it shattered Cedar Rapids' all-American image. If that could happen and the person wasn't caught, anything could happen. The case haunted the investigators too. Some of them had gone to school with Michelle. They felt a personal responsibility to solve it. But how do you solve a murder when you have no fingerprints, no witnesses, no confession, nothing? Then, in 2006, something changed. Detective Doug Larison was reviewing the case files. He'd gone to school with Michelle. He wanted to proceed and move the case forward using new technology. And while reading through the thick files, he discovered something that had been sitting there for years. Blood scrapings from the gear shift of Michelle's car had been sent out for DNA testing at some point, but nobody had ever followed up on the results. They'd just stayed in the file. Lost, forgotten. Larison had the blood tested again using modern techniques, and this time they got a full male DNA profile, the killer's DNA. Technology changes, science changes, and now, finally, they had something concrete. A DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the national database that houses DNA profiles from crime scenes and convicted offenders. If the killer had committed another crime and been caught, his DNA would be in the system and they'd get a match. But there was no match. The killer's DNA wasn't in CODIS, which meant either he'd never been caught for anything else, or he'd committed this murder and then somehow managed to stay clean for the next 30 years. In 2017, the Cedar Rapids Police partnered with a company called Parabon Nanolabs that specialized in something called DNA phenotyping. Using just the DNA, they could predict what the killer looked like: hair color, eye color, face shape, skin tone. The images they generated showed a man with blonde hair and blue eyes. It looked completely different from the 1980 composite sketch. When they released the images to the public, over 100 tips came in. One of Michelle's former classmates even said the face looked like another one of their classmates, but that person had already been tested and cleared years before. Still, no arrest. Still, no answers. And then, in 2018, Parabon Nanolabs told the Cedar Rapids Police about a new technique that was revolutionizing cold case investigations. It was called genetic genealogy, and it had just been used to catch the Golden State Killer in California. The game was about to change. Here's how genetic genealogy works. You take the DNA profile from your crime scene. You upload it to a public genealogy website where people have submitted their DNA to research their family trees. The database compares your unknown suspect's DNA to everyone in the system and finds relatives, even distant ones, second cousins, third cousins. Then you build a family tree. You start with those distant relatives and work backwards, figuring out who their ancestors were, and then you work forwards, figuring out who all the descendants of those ancestors are. Eventually, you narrow it down to a small pool of people who could be your suspect. In May 2018, Parabon entered the killer's DNA profile into a public database called GEDmatch. And they got a hit. A distant cousin, someone who shared enough DNA with the killer to indicate they were related. The genealogists built a family tree, starting with 4 sets of the cousin's great-great-grandparents. The killer was descended from one of those couples. They just had to figure out which branch of the tree he was on. Detective Matthew Denlinger had taken over the case. And here's something poetic. Matthew's father, Harvey Denlinger, had been one of the original investigators back in 1979. Now the son was working the same case his father had worked almost 40 years earlier. Matthew told his dad he was working on it. He wanted someone to talk to who really understood it. And wouldn't it be something, he thought, if he could find the suspect while his dad was still alive? Matthew started contacting people from different branches of the family tree. He'd get DNA samples from them, send them to Parabon, and they'd tell him which branches to eliminate. The first branch, not a match. The second branch, not a match. Then he hit the third branch. In August 2018, he found Janice Burns of Lisbon, Iowa. She consented to providing her DNA. The results came back. She was a first cousin to the killer. That meant the killer was one of Janice's cousins. The investigators identified 3 brothers: Jerry Burns, Kenneth Burns, and Donald Burns. All of them lived in Iowa. All of them were in the right age range. The police began surveillance. They needed DNA from all 3 brothers to figure out which one matched the blood from Michelle's car. But they couldn't just walk up and ask for it. They had to be covert. On October 29, 2018, Detective Denlinger observed Jerry Burns at a Pizza Ranch restaurant in Manchester, Iowa. Burns drank multiple sodas using a plastic straw. When he left, Denlinger went in and recovered the straw from the trash. The DNA from that straw was sent to the lab for testing, and on November 5th, the results came back. It was a match. Not just any match. The probability of finding Jerry Burns' DNA profile among unrelated individuals was less than 1 in 100 billion. Jerry Lynn Burns had killed Michelle Martinko, December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle's murder. Detective Matthew Denlinger walked into Jerry Burns' business, Advanced Power Equipment and Coating Concepts, in Manchester, Iowa. Burns was 64 years old. He was a successful businessman. He owned a powder coating business. He'd previously worked for John Deere and co-owned a truck stop. He'd been married to Patricia Burns, who had died by suicide in 2008. He had children. He was a respected member of his small town. He had no criminal record, nothing, not even a speeding ticket that anyone knew about. Denlinger sat down across from Burns in his office. The detective had a small camera hidden on his coffee cup, recording everything. He told Burns his name had come up in connection with the Michelle Martinko cold case. Burns said he remembered the case. He'd heard about it on the news when it happened. He also, oddly, mentioned Jody Huisentruit, a news anchor who'd been kidnapped in 1995 and never found. Denlinger never brought up Huisentruit. Burns just volunteered it. When Denlinger showed Burns the DNA phenotype images that had been generated in 2017, Burns said, "Do you think I look like that?" "A little bit," Denlinger replied. Wow. Looks a lot different than when I look in the mirror," Burns said. He remained calm. He petted his cat, which was walking back and forth on his desk. He showed almost no emotion. Denlinger explained about the genetic genealogy, about the DNA from the straw, and about the match. Burns denied knowing Michelle. He denied being at the crime scene. He couldn't explain how his DNA got on her dress and on the gear shift of her car. At one point, Denlinger asked if it was possible this happened and Burns didn't remember. Burns said something chilling. "I'm sure something like that would be possible to block out. You block things out of your memories. Was that a confession or just speculation?" Either way, Jerry Burns was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His family was in shock. His daughter Jennifer told CBS, "We did not believe it. This cannot be our dad." But the DNA didn't lie. The trial began in February 2020 in Davenport, Iowa. It had been moved out of Lynn County because of pre-trial publicity. After 40 years, the Michelle Martinko case was finally going to trial. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on DNA evidence. Michael Schmidt, a criminalist with Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation, testified that Burns' DNA matched the blood on both Michelle's dress and the gear shift. Fewer than 1 in 100 billion unrelated individuals would have the same profile. He would only expect such a close match in an identical twin. Burns' 2 brothers had already been tested and eliminated. It was Jerry Burns. There was no doubt. The prosecution also called Michael Allison, a former cellmate of Burns. Allison testified that he'd asked Burns if he did the crime, and Burns said he couldn't talk about it. Later, while they were playing a game, Burns allegedly said if Allison kept beating him, he'd have to take him to the mall. The defense attorney, Leon Spies, tried to cast doubt on the evidence. He pointed out that Cedar Rapids had experienced severe flooding in 2008, which had flooded the police department's basement evidence room. The evidence bags had water damage. Some had visible discoloration. They smelled like the flood. Could the evidence have been contaminated? Could there have been cross-contamination over 40 years of storage? Spies also argued about the straw. He said collecting Burns' DNA from a discarded straw without a warrant violated his constitutional rights. He claimed the genetic genealogy search of GEDmatch was warrantless and unconstitutional. The judge disagreed. The DNA evidence was admitted. Burns had thrown the straw in the trash. He had no reasonable expectation of privacy once he discarded it. The trial lasted about 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours. On February 24, 2020, they returned with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. In the courtroom, Michelle's sister, Janelle Stonebreaker, now 70 years old, hugged her husband, John. She told reporters afterward that she was so happy. There had been so many people accused over the years. She was so pleased they finally had answers. "I wish our parents could have lived to see this," she said. On August 7, 2020, Jerry Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Burns hired Kathleen Zellner, the high-profile attorney known for representing Stephen Avery from Making a Murderer, to appeal his conviction. In March 2023, the Iowa Supreme Court unanimously rejected the appeal, upholding both the conviction and the sentence. Justice David May, writing for the majority, said Burns had no reasonable expectation of privacy when he threw his straw in the trash at Pizza Ranch. The DNA evidence was properly obtained. The conviction stood. Jerry Burns will die in prison. But here's the thing that haunts this case. We still don't know why. Burns never confessed. He never explained. He claimed he didn't know Michelle. There was no known connection between them before the murder. Why did a 25-year-old man from Manchester drive to Cedar Rapids on December 19, 1979? Why did he follow an 18-year-old girl to a mall parking lot? Why did he attack her with such rage, stabbing her 29 times? Was it random? Did he see a beautiful blonde girl and something snapped? Was there some connection we still don't know about? Did he know her somehow, despite his denials? We may never know. Burns isn't talking. What we do know is that for 39 years, Jerry Burns lived a normal life. He went to work, he ran his business, he raised his children, he attended community events. He was, by all accounts, just a regular guy. Meanwhile, Michelle's family lived without answers. Her friends carried the weight of that unsolved mystery. The community of Cedar Rapids was left wondering if the killer was still among them. And he was. The whole time, he was right there, living 2 hours away in Manchester, going about his life as if he hadn't brutally murdered a teenager in a mall parking lot. The Michelle Martinko case represents a turning point in how we solve cold cases. It was one of the first major cases solved through genetic genealogy, and it paved the way for dozens of others. The technique is controversial. Some people argue it's an invasion of privacy. When you submit your DNA to a genealogy website to research your family tree, should law enforcement be able to use that information to investigate your relatives? Should a distant cousin's DNA on GEDmatch lead police to your door? The courts have said yes, at least in the case of Jerry Burns. But the debate continues. For the investigators who never gave up on Michelle, the case represents something simpler. Perseverance. They preserved the evidence. They followed up on leads even when they seemed to go nowhere. And when new technology emerged, they were ready. Detective Matthew Denlinger made his father proud. Harvey Denlinger had worked this case in 1979 and never solved it. But his son did. Wouldn't it be something, Matthew had thought, if he could find the suspect while his dad was still alive? He did. For Michelle's sister Janelle, the conviction brought closure, even if it couldn't bring back her little sister. Michelle should be in her 60s now. She might have grandchildren. She might have become an interior designer like she'd planned. She might have had a beautiful life. Instead, she's buried at Cedar Memorial Park Cemetery in Cedar Rapids. Frozen in time at 18, forever young. Forever the girl with the Farrah Fawcett hair and the bright future. On December 19, 1979, Michelle Martinko went to the mall to pick up a winter coat. It was a simple errand, the kind of thing millions of people do every day without incident. But for Michelle, that trip to the mall ended in a parking lot, in a Buick, in 29 stab wounds and a pool of blood. For 39 years, her killer walked free. He built a life. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it. Maybe he'd even convinced himself it hadn't happened. After all, he'd suggested to Detective Denlinger that people can block things out. But DNA doesn't forget. DNA doesn't lie. And when science finally caught up with Jerry Lynn Burns, there was nowhere left to hide. This case reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it just takes time. It takes investigators who won't give up. It takes new technology. It takes a drinking straw in a trash can and a website where people search for their ancestors. Michelle Martinko deserved better than what happened to her on December 19, 1979. She deserved to grow old. She deserved the life that Jerry Burns stole from her. But at least now she has something. Justice, an answer, a conviction. Her family knows who killed her. The community of Cedar Rapids knows the monster isn't still out there. And Jerry Burns knows that even after 39 years, even after what must have felt like a lifetime of getting away with murder, the truth finally caught up with him. Michelle Martinko's case will be studied in law enforcement academies for years to come. It'll be cited in court cases about DNA and privacy. It'll be featured on true crime shows and podcasts. But we should remember that before it was a famous cold case, before it was a landmark in genetic genealogy, it was a girl. Just a girl who wanted to pick up a coat and go home for Christmas. Rest in peace, Michelle Marie Martinko. October 6, 1961 to December 19, 1979. The girl who disappeared in plain sight. The Kelly Ann Bates tragedy. There's a moment that haunts Margaret Bates to this day. It was late 1995, and she'd just come home to her house in Hattersley, England. She walked into her kitchen and found her 16-year-old daughter, Kelly Ann, standing there. But Kelly Ann wasn't alone. Margaret heard footsteps on the stairs. A man walked into the kitchen. He was in his mid-40s. He was dating her teenage daughter. And Margaret, standing there in her own kitchen, had the strangest, most violent thought of her life. She looked at the bread knife on the counter and thought about picking it up and stabbing this man in the back. It was bizarre, she would later say. I would never normally think of anything so violent. And now I wonder whether it was some sort of sixth sense. She didn't stab him. She talked to him instead. She tried to be reasonable. She tried to get her daughter away from him. But Kelly Ann stayed with that man. And 4 months later, on April 16, 1996, Kelly Ann Bates would be dead at 17 years old. The pathologist who examined her body said that in a career examining almost 600 homicide victims, he had never seen injuries so extensive. This is the story of how a bright, athletic teenager was groomed, isolated, tortured, and murdered by a sadistic predator. And how everyone around her saw the warning signs but couldn't break through the wall he'd built around her. This is the story of Kelly Ann Bates. Kelly Ann Bates was born on May 18, 1978, in Manchester, England. She grew up in Hattersley with her parents, Margaret and Tommy Bates, and her siblings. She was the kind of kid that teachers liked, sporty, social, outgoing. She had dreams of becoming a teacher one day. Her friends remember her as confident and mature for her age. She was funny. She gave her brothers as good as she got. She was competitive in sports. She had that energy that some teenagers have, where they seem like they're ready to take on the world. In 1994, when Kelly Ann was 16, she enrolled at a college in Hyde to improve her GCSE results so she could get onto a teacher training course. She was also working part-time at a graphics firm in Audenshaw to help pay her way through college. She had plans. She had ambition. She had a whole future stretching out ahead of her. And then she met James Patterson Smith. The year was 1993. Kellyanne was 14 years old. She was babysitting for family friends one evening, just a normal teenage job. When the night was over, a man offered to walk her home. To keep her safe, he said, his name was James Patterson Smith. He was 46 years old. Think about that for a second. A 46-year-old man walking a 14-year-old girl home from babysitting. Most people would see that and think it was kind, protective even. But that walk home wasn't kindness. It was the beginning of grooming. Smith had a history. He'd abused women before. He was obsessively jealous. He was controlling. He was violent. And now he'd identified his next victim. A girl who was mature for her age. A girl who hung out with an older crowd. A girl who might be flattered by the attention of an older man. For 2 years, Smith groomed Kellyanne in secret. Her parents had no idea. They didn't know she was seeing anyone, let alone a man in his 40s. By the time Kellyanne was 16, she was completely under his control. She told her parents she had an older boyfriend. Just a bit older, she said. Maybe in his early 20s. When Margaret Bates asked how much older, Kellyanne said he was 32. Margaret wasn't thrilled, but 32 seemed manageable. At least he was an adult with some life experience, right? Wrong. Because James Patterson Smith wasn't 32. He was 48 years old, and both he and Kellyanne had lied about it. Late 1995. Margaret Bates came home to find that man in her kitchen, the one who would make her think about violence for the first time in her life. James Patterson Smith stood there, dating her 16-year-old daughter, and every instinct Margaret had was screaming danger. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Something about him was deeply, fundamentally wrong. But what do you do in that situation? Your teenage daughter has brought home a man who's 3 decades older than her. You want to protect her, but if you push too hard, you risk driving her away. If you're too harsh, she'll just dig in and defend him harder. It's a trap with no good options. Margaret tried to be reasonable. She talked to Smith. She talked to Kellyanne. She made it clear she wasn't happy about the relationship, but Kellyanne insisted she loved him. She insisted he treated her well. She insisted she was happy. And here's where Smith showed how manipulative he really was. He called Kellyanne's parents to discuss his concerns about her staying out all night. He positioned himself as the responsible adult who was worried about their daughter's well-being and played the part perfectly. Margaret wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that maybe this older man really did care about Kellyanne. Maybe he'd look after her. Maybe it would be okay. Shortly after that kitchen meeting, Kellyanne moved in with Smith at his home on Furnival Road in Gorton. Her parents didn't like it, but Kellyanne was 16. She was legally old enough to make her own decisions. They stipulated one thing: she had to stay in contact with them. Kellyanne promised she would. But as the weeks went by, that promise would be broken. The transformation was gradual but noticeable. The bubbly, outgoing Kellyanne started to disappear. She became withdrawn, quiet. She quit her part-time job in December 1995 without explanation. She stopped coming around for family events. When she did visit her parents, they noticed bruises, bite marks. She'd explain them away as accidents. Clumsy, she'd say, bumped into something, fell down. The explanations came quickly, defensively. Margaret tried to talk to her about it, but Kellyanne wouldn't hear it. She defended Smith, she made excuses for him, and she insisted everything was fine. This is what abuse does. It rewires your brain. It makes you defend your abuser even when the evidence is right there on your skin. It makes you believe that the bruises are your fault, that if you just tried harder or were better, he wouldn't have to hurt you. Margaret was terrified. She went to the local police before Kellyanne's death and told them about her concerns. She showed them the bruises. She told them about the bite marks. The domestic violence department gave her leaflets and information about how to identify abuse and how to leave. They told her to give these to Kellyanne, but Margaret never got the chance, because by that point Kellyanne was barely leaving the house. In March 1996, Kellyanne's parents received 2 cards. One was for Tommy's birthday. One was for their wedding anniversary. Neither card was signed by Kellyanne. Only Smith's handwriting was on them. Margaret wanted to go to the house immediately. She knew something was wrong. Tommy wasn't sure. Another family member had spoken to Kellyanne and said she seemed okay. They decided to wait. That decision would haunt them forever. Because by March 1996, Kellyanne was already being subjected to the worst torture imaginable. Content warning. The next section contains descriptions of extreme violence and torture. What James Patterson Smith did to Kellyanne Bates over the final month of her life is almost beyond comprehension. The pathologist who examined her body found over 150 separate injuries. In his entire career examining 600 homicide victims, he said he'd never seen anything like it. Smith used knives, pruning shears, forks, scissors, a spade. He stabbed her multiple times in the legs, body, and mouth. He burned her with a hot iron. He scalded her with boiling water, particularly on her buttocks and legs. He partially scalped her, slashing at her scalp and face with various implements. He mutilated her genitals. He starved her. She lost about 44 pounds. She wasn't given water for several days before her death. He tied her up, sometimes by her hair to radiators or furniture, sometimes by her neck with a ligature. The house later revealed strands of Kellyanne's hair tied around various pieces of furniture, physical evidence of her captivity. And then there were her eyes. At some point between 5 days and 3 weeks before her death, Smith gouged out Kellyanne's eyes from their sockets. She spent the final days of her life blind, in agony, starving, dehydrated, and covered in wounds. The prosecutor at Smith's trial said it best. The physical pain would have been intense, causing anguish and torment to the point of mental breakdown and collapse. It was as if he deliberately disfigured her, causing her the utmost pain, distress, and degradation. The injuries were not the result of one sudden eruption of violence. They must have been caused over a long period and were so extensive and so terrible that the defendant must have deliberately and systematically tortured the girl. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't an argument that got out of hand. This was prolonged, deliberate, sadistic torture. And Kellyanne endured it for weeks. On April 16, 1996, James Patterson Smith walked into a police station and calmly reported that his girlfriend had died. He claimed it was an accident. They'd been arguing, he said. She was in the bathtub. She inhaled water and drowned. He tried to resuscitate her but couldn't save her. He even claimed she had a habit of pretending to be unconscious to wind him up. The police went to the house on Furnival Road. They went upstairs to the bedroom, and what they found was carnage. Blood was splattered on the walls and ceiling. Kellyanne's naked body was lying in a bathtub. Her blood was throughout the entire house. The officers who responded to that scene would never forget what they saw. When the pathologist began his examination, the full scope of Smith's depravity became clear. Over 150 separate injuries. Stab wounds, burns, scalding, starvation, dehydration, partial scalping, genital mutilation, and those empty eye sockets where her eyes had been gouged out days or weeks before. The cause of death was drowning. Smith had beaten her about the head with a shower head and then drowned her in the bathtub. After weeks of torture that should have killed her multiple times over, it was water in her lungs that finally ended her suffering. The police had the grim task of informing Kelly Ann's parents. Margaret was at home when she heard a knock on the door. The officers told her that her daughter was dead, murdered, tortured to death by the man Margaret had wanted to stab in her kitchen 4 months earlier. That instinct, that sixth sense, had been right all along. James Patterson Smith was arrested and charged with murder. The case went to trial in 1997, and the details that emerged were so horrific that the jury was offered professional counseling. All of them accepted. It was the first time in British legal history that counseling was offered to a jury. The prosecution laid out the torture Kelly Ann had endured. They showed photographs of her injuries. They detailed the systematic nature of the abuse. They painted a picture of a sadistic predator who had tortured a teenage girl to death over the course of weeks. Other women came forward, women that Smith had abused in the past. They testified about his obsessive jealousy, his need for control, his violence. A pattern emerged. Kelly Ann wasn't his first victim. She was just the one he killed. And what was Smith's defense? He claimed he was the real victim. He said Kelly Ann drove him to it by winding him up. He claimed she put him through hell. He even suggested that she inflicted some of the injuries on herself to make him look bad. Think about that. A 17-year-old girl starved herself, burned herself, stabbed herself, scalded herself, gouged out her own eyes, all to frame her boyfriend. The jury didn't buy it for a second. It took them just 1 hour to find 49-year-old James Patterson Smith guilty of murder. On November 19, 1997, Judge Mr. Justice Sachs sentenced Smith to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. Some accounts say 25 years. In handing down the sentence, the judge said, "This has been a terrible case, a catalogue of depravity by one human being upon another. You are a highly dangerous person. You are an abuser of women, and I intend, so far as it is in my power, that you will abuse no more." James Patterson Smith is still in prison to this day. He will likely die there, and that's exactly what he deserves. After Kelly Ann's death, people ask the same questions they always ask in cases like this. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she tell someone? How did her parents not know? These questions, while natural, miss the fundamental reality of grooming and abuse. Kelly Ann didn't choose to stay with Smith any more than a kidnapping victim chooses to stay with their captor. Smith began grooming her when she was 14. He was in his mid-40s. He was an adult with decades of life experience. She was a child. The power imbalance was staggering from the very beginning. By the time she was 16 and moved in with him, he'd already spent 2 years conditioning her to trust him, to depend on him, to believe that he loved her and that she loved him. He'd isolated her from her friends and family. He'd made himself the center of her world. And once the abuse began, he used classic abuser tactics. The violence would be followed by apologies, by promises to change, and by moments of tenderness that made her believe the good version of him was the real version and the violent version was just temporary. He also used shame. Kelly Ann came home with bruises and bite marks, but she explained them away as accidents because admitting the truth would have meant admitting she'd made a terrible mistake. It would have meant facing her parents. "I told you so." It would have meant losing the relationship she'd invested everything in. And by the final month of her life, when the torture escalated to unimaginable levels, she was physically incapable of leaving. She was tied up, she was starving, she was blind, she was dying. As for her parents, they did try. Margaret went to the police. She tried to give Kellyanne information about domestic violence. She wanted to go to the house when the cards arrived without Kellyanne's signature. But you can't force a teenager to leave a relationship they don't want to leave. You can't kidnap your own daughter and lock her away for her own protection. The system failed Kellyanne. The domestic violence resources weren't enough. The police didn't intervene. The neighbors who must have heard something didn't call for help. And Smith, who had a history of abusing women, was allowed to continue until he finally killed someone. The murder of Kellyanne Bates remains one of the most brutal cases of domestic violence in British history. It's studied in criminal justice programs. It's featured in documentaries. It's discussed in forums about domestic abuse and how to prevent it. But before it was a case study, it was a girl. A girl who loved sports. A girl who wanted to be a teacher. A girl who was friendly and outgoing and had her whole life ahead of her. James Patterson Smith took that life. He took it slowly, painfully, sadistically. He tortured her for weeks. He gouged out her eyes. He starved her. And then he drowned her and tried to claim it was an accident. For Margaret and Tommy Bates, the pain never goes away. Margaret has said that she lost the best thing that ever happened to her. She lives with the knowledge that her instinct was right that day in the kitchen. She should have picked up that knife. She should have done something, anything, to keep that man away from her daughter. But she didn't, because we live in a society where we're supposed to be reasonable, where we're supposed to give people the benefit of the doubt, where we're not supposed to judge relationships or interfere in people's lives. And sometimes that civility kills. Kellyanne Bates should be in her mid-40s now. She might have become a teacher like she wanted. She might have had children of her own. She might have run marathons or coached youth sports or done any number of things with the athletic, outgoing personality she had as a teenager. Instead, she's buried in a cemetery in Manchester. She was 17 years old. She'd barely started living. The case of Kellyanne Bates teaches us uncomfortable truths. It teaches us that age gap relationships between adults and teenagers are inherently predatory, no matter how mature the teenager seems. It teaches us that grooming doesn't always look obvious. It teaches us that abusers are often charming and manipulative, especially in the beginning. It teaches us that domestic violence can escalate to levels of brutality that seem impossible. And it teaches us that we need to do more, as a society, to protect vulnerable people from predators. If you see a 46-year-old man walking a 14-year-old girl home, that's not kindness. That's grooming. If you see a teenager with bruises and bite marks making excuses, that's not clumsiness. That's abuse. If you see someone pulling away from their friends and family after starting a new relationship, that's not love, that's isolation. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if you have the chance to intervene, to speak up, to offer help, do it. It might be uncomfortable, it might create conflict, but it might also save a life. Margaret Bates will spend the rest of her life wishing she'd picked up that knife in her kitchen. She'll wish she'd trusted her instinct and done whatever it took to keep James Patterson Smith away from her daughter. We can't change what happened to Kellyanne, but we can learn from it. We can be vigilant. We can speak up, and we can create a world where vulnerable young people are protected from predators instead of being delivered into their hands. Rest in peace, Kellyanne Bates, May 18, 1978 to April 16, 1996. The Donna Jones story, A Life Stolen by Silence. There's a photograph of Donna Ellen Jones that her friends can't look at without crying. It's from her university days. She's laughing, her whole face lit up with genuine joy. Her eyes are bright. She looks free. Just 4 years after that photo was taken, Donna would be dead at 33 years old. And the way she died was so horrific, so unthinkable, that when the details finally came out in court, even hardened homicide detectives had to step outside the courtroom. This is a story about how someone can vanish in plain sight, how a vibrant, intelligent, successful woman can be slowly erased by the person who promised to love her, and how everyone around her saw the warning signs but couldn't break through the wall that had been built around her. This is the story of Donna Ellen Jones. Christmas Day, 1975. Donna Ellen Jones came into the world in Ottawa, Canada, and from the very beginning, she was special. Not in some Hollywood movie way, but in the way that matters. She was kind, she was smart, she worked hard. Her friends from high school remember her as the type of person who'd notice if you were having a bad day, the one who'd share her lunch if you forgot yours. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just genuinely good. Donna didn't come from money. She wasn't handed anything. She earned it. She put herself through Carleton University, studying hard, working part-time jobs, doing what thousands of young Canadians do every year. But Donna actually finished. She graduated. And she didn't just graduate and then flounder around wondering what to do next. Donna got a real job, a good job. She became a civil servant with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. It might not sound glamorous, but it was stable. It was important work, it paid well, and Donna was good at it. Here's the thing that really matters, though. By her late 20s, Donna had paid off her student loans. Do you know how rare that is? She didn't just pay them off, she bought a house. On her own, in Ottawa, a whole house. Think about that for a second. A single woman in her 20s. No help from family money. No secret inheritance, just hard work and smart decisions, and she owned property outright. Her friends described the Donna of this era as bubbly, outgoing, happy. She had her life together in a way that most people twice her age don't. She had friends who loved her. She had a career she was building. She had a future that looked bright. And then, in the summer of 2005, everything changed. She met a man named Mark Peter Hutt. A mutual friend introduced them. That's how these stories often start, isn't it? Someone you trust says, "Hey, I know someone you should meet." It feels safe. It feels vetted. If your friend likes them, they must be okay, right? Mark Hutt wasn't some obvious monster. He didn't have a tattoo on his forehead saying, "Danger." He was just a guy who paid attention to Donna, a guy who seemed interested in her. At first, her friends didn't think much of it. Donna was dating someone. Good for her. She deserved to be happy. But then, they started noticing changes. Donna stopped coming to things. Girls' nights became, "I can't make it, sorry." Weekend plans became, "Maybe next time." Phone calls became shorter. Text messages became less frequent. When you're in your 30s, this kind of thing happens sometimes. People get into relationships and they disappear a little bit. They're in that honeymoon phase where they want to spend all their time with their new person. It's annoying, but it's normal. Except this felt different. Because when they did see Donna, she wasn't the same. The bubbly personality had dimmed. The outgoing woman who used to be the life of the party was quiet now, reserved, like she was calculating every word before she said it. And at work, people noticed too. Donna, who had always been reliable, started making mistakes. Her performance was slipping. The woman who had worked so hard to build her career suddenly seemed like she didn't care about it anymore. Something was wrong. But here's the insidious thing about abuse. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly, so slowly that by the time you realize what's happening, you're already trapped. By 2007, Donna's friends weren't just concerned anymore. They were scared. They'd see bruises. Donna would explain them away. "Clumsy," she'd say. "Ran into something." You know me, so accident-prone. The explanations were always quick, always delivered with a little laugh that didn't reach her eyes. They'd hear how Mark spoke to her. Once, during a phone call, they heard him in the background calling her names. Vicious, degrading names that made them flinch. When they asked Donna about it, she'd defend him. "He's stressed," she'd say. "Work has been hard. I shouldn't have bothered him." The woman who owned her own house, who had paid off her student loans, who had been so independent and capable, was now making excuses for a man who called her names. And then came the real test. In September 2007, Donna announced she was marrying Mark Hutt. Her friends couldn't stay silent anymore. They confronted her. Not in a mean way, not ganging up on her, but from a place of genuine love and fear. They told her what they'd seen. They told her they were worried. They practically begged her not to go through with it. Donna denied everything. She insisted Mark loved her. She said they were happy, and then she married him anyway. Imagine being those friends. Imagine watching someone you love walk into what you know is danger and being completely powerless to stop them. Imagine that feeling of helplessness. But here's what you need to understand about abuse victims. It's not that they're stupid. It's not that they're weak. It's that abuse rewires your brain. It makes you doubt your own perception of reality. It isolates you from the people who could help you. It makes you believe that the abuse is somehow your fault, that if you just try harder, be better, he'll change. Donna wasn't stupid. She was trapped. What happened behind closed doors in that marriage is the stuff of nightmares. Mark Hutt didn't just hit Donna. He systematically destroyed her. Physically, psychologically, financially. Remember that house Donna bought on her own? That symbol of her independence, her hard work, her success? Hutt took control of it. He moved in and made it his domain. The place that had represented Donna's freedom became her prison. He controlled the money. Every dollar. Donna, who had been financially independent enough to pay off student loans and buy property, suddenly couldn't spend money without his permission. This is classic abuser behavior. When you control someone's finances, you control their ability to leave. Where can you go with no money? How can you start over when you can't even afford a security deposit on an apartment? He controlled where she went, who she saw, who she could talk to, how long she could be gone. She had to account for every minute, every conversation, every interaction. Think about what that does to a person. Imagine having to justify a trip to the grocery store, having to explain why you talk to a neighbor, having to get permission to call your own mother. That's not a marriage, that's captivity. And the physical abuse was relentless. It wasn't occasional. It wasn't just when he was drunk or stressed or angry. It was constant. It was part of the fabric of their daily life. Over the course of their marriage, Donna's weight plummeted. She went from 162 pounds to 101 pounds. For context, at 5 feet 6 inches, 101 pounds is severely underweight, dangerously underweight. She wasn't dieting. She was being starved and abused. The autopsy would later reveal the full scope of what Mark Hutt did to his wife. 9 fractured ribs, a broken nose, 2 black eyes, air rifle pellets embedded in her skin, burns, bruises in various stages of healing, meaning this wasn't one incident. This was constant. This was her life. He shot her with an air rifle multiple times, just because he could, and still, Donna couldn't escape. Or maybe more accurately, she didn't believe she could escape. When you're that deep in abuse, when someone has broken you down so completely, escape doesn't even seem like an option anymore. You just try to survive one more day. But Donna wouldn't survive. December 5th, 2009. Donna Ellen Jones died of septic shock from infection due to untreated burns. She was 33 years old. It was 20 days before Christmas, the day she was born. Here's what happened. Mark Hutt had scalded her with boiling water, deliberately poured it on her. The burns covered about 40% of her body. 40%. If you get burned over that much of your body, you need immediate medical attention. You need to be in a hospital. Those kinds of burns can kill you through shock, through infection, through organ failure. Everyone knows this. Mark Hutt knew this, but he didn't call for help. He didn't take her to the hospital. He watched her suffer. He watched the burns get infected. He watched her get sicker and sicker. And then she stopped breathing. She stopped breathing, and he still didn't call 911. Not right away. He waited. For 11 days, there was a dead woman in that house, and Mark Hutt went about his business. 11 days. When he finally did call 911, he tried to claim it was an accident, that she'd slipped in the bathtub, that he didn't realize how bad it was. But the paramedics saw immediately that this was no accident. The police were called. And when they started investigating, when they started piecing together Donna's final years, the full horror of what she'd endured became clear. This wasn't manslaughter. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. Prolonged, sadistic, deliberate murder. Mark Peter Hutt was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The wheels of justice began to turn, but they turned slowly. Too slowly for a woman who had already been failed by so many systems meant to protect her. During the trial, which finally took place in 2013, the evidence was overwhelming. The courtroom became a place where Donna's silent suffering finally had a voice, where all the things she couldn't say while she was alive were laid bare for everyone to see. The medical examiner took the stand and testified about the extent of Donna's injuries. The courtroom fell silent as the doctor described each wound, each broken bone, and each mark of violence on her body. Some people in the gallery cried, some had to leave. Even the judge looked shaken. Friends testified about the changes they'd seen in her. They talked about the vibrant woman she'd been before Mark Hutt. They talked about watching her disappear. They talked about their guilt, their regret, and their desperate wish that they'd done more. Their testimony was heartbreaking because you could hear the weight of their grief and their what-ifs. Co-workers testified about her declining performance, about how the star employee had become withdrawn and mistake-prone. They talked about conversations where they'd asked if everything was okay, and Donna had smiled and said she was fine. Fine. That word that women use when everything is falling apart but they don't know how to ask for help. Phone records showed her increasing isolation. The data told a story of a social life collapsing. Fewer calls, shorter conversations, a world shrinking down to just her and her abuser. And the physical evidence spoke volumes. The burns, the broken bones, the pellets, the evidence of starvation. Each piece of evidence was another indictment not just of Mark Hutt, but of a system that had somehow allowed this to happen for years without intervention. Hutt's defense tried to claim it was an accident, that he didn't mean to kill her, that he was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do. But the prosecution demolished that argument. You don't accidentally pour boiling water on someone. You don't accidentally shoot them with air rifle pellets multiple times. You don't accidentally break 9 of their ribs, and you definitely don't accidentally wait 11 days after someone dies to call for help. The jury deliberated, and in 2013 they came back with their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Mark Peter Hutt was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Some people heard that verdict and felt relief. Justice had been served, they thought. But had it really? Because Donna was still dead. She was still gone at 33, her whole life ahead of her stolen by a man who was supposed to love her. No prison sentence brings her back. No verdict gives her friends another chance to save her. No amount of justice restores the life she could have had. After Donna's death, people asked the questions they always ask in cases like this. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she tell someone? Why didn't she fight back? These questions, as understandable as they are, miss the point entirely. They put the responsibility on the victim instead of the abuser. They suggest that somehow Donna could have prevented her own murder if she'd just made different choices. But here's the truth about domestic violence. It's not about one bad decision. It's about a systematic campaign of control and terror that strips away your ability to make decisions at all. Mark Hutt didn't wake up one day and suddenly become a murderer. He started small. Maybe it was just criticism at first. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. Nobody else would put up with you. Little comments that seem almost reasonable, but that plant seeds of doubt. Then, maybe it's isolation. Do we really need to go to that party? Your friends don't really get you like I do. Why don't we just stay in? Before you know it, you haven't seen your friends in months, and when you try to reconnect, there are consequences. Then comes the control. I'll handle the money. You're not good with finances. Let me check your phone. If you got nothing to hide, it shouldn't matter. Where were you? Who were you with? What took so long? And finally, the violence. It starts with something that might even seem small, a push, a grab that's too tight, and then it escalates. Because once that line is crossed, once he knows he can hurt you and you won't leave, the violence becomes a tool, a way to control you. By the time Donna was being scalded with boiling water, she'd already endured years of this escalation. She was already so broken down, so controlled, so isolated that escape seemed impossible. That's why she didn't leave. Not because she was weak, but because Mark Hutt had systematically destroyed her ability to believe she could. But here's what haunts Donna's friends and family. The opportunities that were missed. The moments when intervention might have made a difference. Her friends confronted her before the wedding. They told her they were worried, but they didn't know how to push harder without pushing her away entirely. And maybe if they had pushed harder, she would have just cut them off completely and been even more isolated. Her co-workers noticed her declining performance. But workplace culture doesn't always make space for asking, is everything okay at home? It's easier to focus on the work, to chalk it up to personal problems, to mind your own business. Medical professionals must have seen her at some point during those years. Did any of them notice the weight loss, the injuries? Did anyone ask the right questions? The truth is, domestic violence thrives in silence and privacy. It thrives when people see warning signs but don't know what to do. It thrives when victims feel like they can't reach out for help. Could Donna have been saved? Maybe. If the right person had asked the right question at the right time. If the systems designed to protect abuse victims had been more accessible or more effective. If Mark Hutt had faced consequences for his behavior before it escalated to murder. But she wasn't saved. And that's something that everyone who knew her has to carry. So, what do we do with a story like Donna's? We could just shake our heads and move on. Another tragic news story. Another statistic. Another reminder that bad things happen to good people. But that would be a disservice to her memory. Donna Ellen Jones was a real person. She had dreams and goals and friends who loved her. She worked hard. She bought a house. She was kind to the people around her. She mattered. And the fact that her life was cut short in such a brutal way should make us all pay attention. Because Donna's story isn't unique. Every single day, women are being abused by their partners. Right now, in your neighborhood, in your city, someone is experiencing what Donna experienced. They're being isolated, controlled, and hurt, and they're staying silent because they're afraid, or ashamed, or because they've been conditioned to believe that this is normal, that this is love, and that they somehow deserve it. Donna's story should remind us to pay attention to the people in our lives, to notice when someone changes, to ask the hard questions even when it's uncomfortable, to believe people when they tell us something is wrong. It should remind us that abuse isn't always obvious. It doesn't always look like what we see in movies. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's the woman who seems to have it all together but who's slowly disappearing. And it should remind us that leaving an abusive relationship is not simple. It's not just a matter of walking out the door. It's dangerous. It requires resources, support, safety planning. The most dangerous time for an abuse victim is when they try to leave.